Frank sat alone in the corner booth of the small-town diner, the hum of morning chatter and clinking coffee cups blending into a familiar background noise he barely noticed anymore. At 67, days felt like repetitions of the same tune: wake up, take his pills, watch the news, eat a cold breakfast, and wonder if anyone still remembered he existed. He stared at the flickering television mounted near the ceiling, the screen showing an astonishing sight: a colossal rocket, gleaming silver under the Texas sun, preparing to launch. The announcer's voice was electric, talking about SpaceX's Starship, Elon Musk's latest audacious project, promising to change the course of American space exploration forever. The word struck Frank like a lightning bolt. What if everything I believed about getting old was wrong, he thought, eyes fixed on the rocket as if it was a lifeline thrown just for him. His mind raced with memories he'd buried. Dreams shelved decades ago, a younger self filled with fire and ambition, now dulled by years of routine and regret. He felt like a relic, a forgotten man in a world sprinting ahead without him. But Musk's vision of pushing limits, of daring to dream boldly regardless of the odds, sparked something deep inside Frank. Could he, too, take a giant leap, even at his age? Could this rocket launch be a metaphor for his own overdue takeoff? Frank reached out and tapped the table to silence the small radio app playing in his pocket. The moment felt urgent, charged. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from, a voice crackled from the app's podcast. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank realized, with a lump in his throat, that for him, it had been hope, or at least the faintest flicker of it. And maybe, just maybe, that flicker was ready to grow into a blaze. Frank had always been a man of simple routines, a product of a small Ohio town where everyone knew your name, your history, and, often, your failures. Born in the late 1950s, he grew up with dreams bigger than the rusty factories and quiet streets that defined his childhood. When he was young, Frank had imagined himself building something extraordinary, maybe even designing rockets like the ones he read about in his battered science magazines. But life, as it often does, had other plans. He worked hard at the local manufacturing plant, a job that paid the bills but dulled his spirit. He married Susan, a kind woman with an easy laugh, and together they raised a daughter, Lisa. For a while, Frank felt the steady rhythm of family life was enough, a kind of comfort in the known. But as years passed, the factory slowed down, machines were replaced by automation, and Frank felt the ground shift beneath him. Retirement came earlier than he had hoped, more out of necessity than choice, and with it, an emptiness he hadn't prepared for. His body, once strong from years of labor, now protested with aches and stiffness, and his mind drifted to what could have been. The house felt too quiet after Susan died 3 years ago, a sudden heart attack that left Frank adrift. Lisa moved to the city, busy with her own life, leaving calls unanswered and visits rare. The loneliness settled in like an unwelcome guest, and Frank's days blurred together. Yet, beneath the surface of grief and regret, a seed of longing remained, a memory he revisited often. In the garage, covered in dust and spider webs, sat a half-finished model rocket he had started building back in his 40s. It was a project born from youthful fascination, something Susan had encouraged with gentle smiles. That rocket symbolized more than just a hobby, it was a testament to a self that refused to fade completely, a reminder of the dreams he had buried but never forgotten. On nights when sleep escaped him, Frank would stare at the model, tracing its worn edges and faded paint, wondering if it was too late to try again. Maybe I'm just too old, he thought, the words tasting bitter. But then, a newscast about Elon Musk and the Starship would catch his eye, and the doubt would falter. Musk's relentless pursuit of the impossible, his willingness to fail forward, challenged Frank's quiet resignation. Could someone who seemed larger than life really be the spark that reignited a forgotten flame inside an old man in Ohio? The question lingered, stirring feelings Frank hadn't felt in years: hope, curiosity, and a restless energy he thought was lost. He remembered his father's words from long ago, about how age was just a number, and that a man was only as old as his dreams. With that memory, Frank made a silent promise to himself, maybe this time, he would dare to dream again. Frank's mind was a battlefield where hope and doubt clashed endlessly. Each morning, he woke to the same question gnawing at him, is it too late? The weight of years pressed down on his chest, a relentless reminder that time was not on his side. His knees ached from arthritis, his breath came a little shorter with every step, and his reflection in the mirror showed the slow retreat of vitality. Yet, somewhere deep inside, a spark flickered, fed by the news clips of Elon Musk's Starship launch, the audacity of a man who refused to accept limits, who rewrote what was possible. But could Frank do the same? Or was he just fooling himself? At the doctor's office, Dr. Patel was gentle but firm. Frank, you have to slow down. Your heart isn't what it used to be. Pushing yourself could be dangerous. The warning felt like a verdict, a label marking him as fragile and finished. The doctor's words echoed the doubts Frank heard elsewhere. Sometimes in his own voice, sometimes in the quiet judgment of the world around him. His daughter Lisa was polite but distant during their phone calls. "Dad, I'm just worried you're chasing shadows. You should focus on resting, not building rockets in your garage." Her skepticism stung, a reminder that even the people he loved struggled to believe in this late-life rebellion. Society seemed to write off men like Frank once they passed a certain age, as if their chapters were closed and their value diminished. He felt invisible in grocery stores, overlooked in conversations, a ghost wandering through a world too fast to wait for him. But then, one night, scrolling through an online forum, Frank stumbled on a quote from Elon Musk that struck a chord: "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." The words pulsed through Frank's veins, a lifeline tossed across the void of despair. That was the glimmer of hope he needed to face his inner war. Yet, the war raged on. One evening, after a particularly difficult conversation with Lisa, Frank sat alone in his dimly lit living room, the glow of the television casting shadows on the walls. The Starship launch was replaying, the massive rocket lifting off against a blazing sky. Musk's voice was calm but resolute, describing the mission's challenges and dreams. "Failure is an option here. If things are not failing, you are not innovating enough." The mantra rolled over Frank's heart, challenging his fears. Could he embrace failure as a step forward instead of a stop sign? Could he silence the voices telling him to settle into the slow fate of old age? The tension inside him twisted tighter as exhaustion and doubt battled against the stirring hope. Could he really reclaim a life that felt lost? Did anyone care if he tried? That question gnawed deeper than any ache in his bones. Still, Musk's example was a beacon, fearless, relentless, revolutionary. The man had disrupted industries, defied critics, and seemed to live at the edge of what was possible. If Elon Musk could dare to dream giant dreams, even in the face of overwhelming odds, why couldn't Frank? That night, Frank made a quiet decision. He would fight the inner war by taking one small, bold step. The journey ahead was uncertain and steep, but he was no longer willing to stand still in the shadow of doubt. The battle for his future had begun. The next morning, Frank woke with a restless energy he hadn't felt in years. The weight of indecision lifted just enough for him to act. He shuffled to the garage, the same space where the ghosts of his past dreams lingered quietly beneath layers of dust and forgotten tools. There, on a rickety workbench, lay the half-finished model rocket he'd started decades ago, its paint chipped, its parts scattered like pieces of a long-lost promise. With trembling hands, Frank brushed away the grime, the smell of old wood and metal filling his senses. It was like greeting an old friend, a part of himself that had waited patiently all these years. He pulled out a worn notebook filled with sketches and notes from a younger man who once believed anything was possible. Inspired by Elon Musk's Starship videos still fresh in his mind, Frank decided he would finish the rocket, not for anyone else, but for himself. The decision felt monumental and yet beautifully simple. He wasn't launching a spacecraft to Mars, but he was launching a new chapter of his own life. That afternoon, Frank cleared his calendar and began working steadily, measuring, cutting, gluing, and repainting. The aches in his hands reminded him he was no longer young, but the fire in his chest burned brighter than any pain. Each small progress felt like a victory against the years of resignation. His neighbors peeked curiously at the garage window, whispering among themselves about the old man who had suddenly found a new hobby. Some scoffed, others smiled in encouragement. Even Lisa noticed the change during their rare phone calls. "I don't get it, Dad. Why a rocket now? You could be enjoying your retirement." Frank hesitated but replied, "Because I'm not done yet, Lisa. I'm not ready to give up." For the first time, his daughter's voice softened, though still cautious. Inspired by Elon Musk's relentless pursuit, Frank decided not to keep his journey private. He started a blog, writing about his feelings, his project, and the struggles of growing older in a world that often sidelines people like him. The blog was raw and honest, filled with moments of doubt, fleeting victories, and the quiet determination of a man reclaiming his life. To his surprise, readers began to respond, sharing their own stories of late reinvention and hidden dreams. This small digital community became a lifeline, a place where Frank's hope found echo and amplification. Meanwhile, Frank's daily routine shifted dramatically. He began walking every morning around the neighborhood, a ritual to strengthen his body for the work ahead. The walks were slow at first, but with each step, his confidence grew. He imagined Elon Musk pacing the halls of SpaceX headquarters, fueled by vision and relentless energy, and borrowed that mental image to push through his own physical limits. There were days when the old doubts crept back, when his knees screamed after a long walk or when the model rocket refused to fit together the way it should. But Frank remembered Musk's words, "Persistence is very important. You shouldn't give up unless you're forced to give up." With that, he pressed on, refusing to let setbacks become excuses. Frank's newfound determination began to ripple through his small town. At the grocery store, a few neighbors nodded approvingly. At the diner, the waitress who once thought him invisible now stopped to ask about his progress. The garage, once a tomb of forgotten dreams, buzzed with life and possibility. Frank wasn't just building a rocket, he was rebuilding himself. The rocket project became more than a hobby. It was a symbol of defiance against age, against invisibility, against the slow surrender many felt pressured to accept. And in this small garage, inspired by the boldness of Elon Musk's Starship mission, Frank took his first real step toward a life transformed. This choice, simple on the surface but profound beneath, rekindled a fire that would not be easily extinguished. For the first time in a long time, Frank believed that his story was far from over. He was ready to launch. The days following Frank's decision to rebuild his rocket were filled with a strange kind of magic, an energy born from hope, action, and the quiet conviction that he was reclaiming something precious. His garage became a sanctuary, a workshop of possibility where the smell of paint and glue mingled with the scent of old wood and fresh beginnings. Every small success, a carefully glued fin, a smoothly sanded edge, a perfectly balanced body, felt like a personal victory. But it wasn't just the rocket that was changing. Frank himself was transforming. He walked with a steadier step, his eyes brighter, and his mind sharper. The routine that once chained him to a slow fade into obscurity was replaced with purpose. He started to share his journey on his blog more frequently, writing not only about the technical challenges but also about the emotional roller coaster of facing aging head-on. His honesty resonated with readers across the country. Emails and comments poured in from strangers who found courage in Frank's story, people who had shelved their own dreams under the weight of time and doubt. Among the messages was one that stood out, a note from a local newspaper reporter who wanted to write a piece about Frank's late-life reinvention. The article was published on a crisp autumn morning, featuring Frank and his dusty garage rocket under the headline, "Ohio Man's Dream Ignites at 67." Suddenly, Frank found himself the subject of curiosity and admiration. Neighbors stopped to congratulate him, some with tears in their eyes, others with smiles of genuine respect. The story even caught the attention of Lisa, who called more often, her voice warmer and less hesitant. One evening, after a particularly long day of work, Frank sat in his favorite chair, the soft glow of the television casting shadows on the walls. He watched the live broadcast of SpaceX's Starship launch, the massive rocket ascending against the evening sky, a symbol of bold vision and relentless pursuit. The crowd's cheers, the engineers' focused faces, Elon Musk's calm confidence, it all stirred something deep within Frank. He felt connected not just to the moment but to a larger movement, a wave of change sweeping through the world and through himself. It was as if Musk's audacity had become a personal mantra, to dream big, to embrace failure, to keep pushing forward. But victory was never without vulnerability. One chilly morning, Frank's heart ached not from physical strain but from an unexpected message. Lisa had sent a terse email, questioning his obsession with the rocket and warning him about the risks of disappointment. It stung deeply, a reminder that healing old wounds was never easy. Yet, instead of retreating, Frank chose to respond with openness. He wrote about his fears, his hopes, and the reasons he refused to let age define his limits. This exchange, raw and honest, marked a turning point. Frank realized that breaking through wasn't just about building rockets or proving others wrong, it was about reconnecting, about vulnerability as much as strength. One afternoon, as the sun spilled golden light into the garage, Frank completed the final assembly of his rocket model. It stood on the workbench, sleek and proud, a testament to years of regret, hope, and relentless effort. The moment was electric, charged with emotion. He carefully packed the rocket for its first test launch at a nearby open field. That day, surrounded by a small group of curious neighbors, Frank set up the launch pad with trembling hands and a steady heart. As he counted down, his breath caught in his throat. Then, with a roar and a burst of flame, the rocket soared into the sky, climbing higher than anyone expected. Cheers erupted around him, but Frank's eyes filled with tears, not for the applause, but for the journey that had brought him here. He had broken through the barriers of doubt, age, and loneliness. In that soaring rocket, he saw reflected his own flight back to life. The victory was not just a test flight but a symbol of what was possible when fear was met with courage. Frank's story spread beyond the town, inspiring others who had felt trapped by the passage of time. His blog gained followers, his story was shared on social media, and his message became clear: it's never too late to start again, to chase a dream, to take your own giant leap. As the days turned into weeks, Frank and Lisa began to rebuild their fragile relationship, finding common ground in the shared language of hope and renewal. They talked about the past, the mistakes, and the future, no longer strangers but allies in the journey. And through it all, Elon Musk's example remained a guiding star, a reminder that the future belonged not just to the young but to anyone brave enough to reach for it. Frank had found his spark, and with it, a new beginning. Frank sat quietly on the porch of his modest home, the cool evening breeze carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves and freshly turned earth. The sky above was painted in shades of deep blue and orange, the kind of sunset that made the world feel both vast and intimate. He held a worn photograph in his hands, a picture of his younger self, smiling wide and full of dreams, standing beside Susan and a little Lisa who was clutching a small model rocket. That image had once felt like a distant memory, a ghost of a life slipping through his fingers. But now, as he looked at it, he understood that it was not an end but a beginning. The journey he had taken, the battles fought within, the small choices that had sparked change, the courageous steps forward, had reshaped not just his days but his very soul. Frank's blog had become more than a personal diary, it was a beacon for others who felt invisible in the face of aging. Letters arrived daily from people who found strength in his story, a retired teacher who took up painting, a widow who started volunteering, a veteran who launched a community garden. Frank realized that his story had sparked a ripple effect, a new legacy born not from grand achievements but from the simple act of refusing to give up. He thought about Elon Musk, not as a distant, unreachable figure but as a symbol of what was possible when fear is cast aside. Musk's relentless drive and fearless vision had reminded Frank that limits were often self-imposed, that courage was a muscle strengthened by action. Frank now saw himself in that light, not a man defeated by years but a man reborn through persistence and hope. He reflected on the past few years, the loneliness after Susan's death, the frayed relationship with Lisa, the moments of despair when giving up seemed easier. Yet, those hardships had become the soil from which resilience grew. Frank smiled softly, remembering the test launch in the field, the cheers from neighbors, the hesitant but heartfelt calls from Lisa. They had all been part of the climb out of darkness. The rocket on his workbench was no longer just a model, it was a symbol of transformation, a testament to what a man can accomplish when he chooses to act. Frank felt a peace that had eluded him for decades. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending the struggles didn't exist. It was about embracing the totality of his story and finding meaning in every chapter. I was never too old, he thought, I was just waiting for permission to matter again. And in granting himself that permission, Frank had opened a door not just for himself but for countless others. As twilight deepened, Frank's phone buzzed with a message from Lisa. "Dad, I'm proud of you. Keep flying." His heart swelled. The road ahead was still unknown, but now, with hope as his compass, Frank was ready for whatever came next. His legacy was no longer a question of what he had missed but a celebration of what he had courageously reclaimed. The stars above twinkled like distant promises, and in that vast expanse, Frank found his place, not as a man left behind but as a pioneer of his own life's next giant leap. Frank's story had begun as a quiet rebellion in a small Ohio town, a solitary man rebuilding a dusty model rocket in his garage. Yet, like the ripples spreading from a stone dropped into a still pond, his actions began to reach far beyond his neighborhood. The blog he started as a personal journal blossomed into a vibrant community, a digital town square where people in their 60s, 70s, and beyond shared their struggles, dreams, and small victories. Emails came from all corners of the country, retirees who had put away their passions for decades, caregivers seeking inspiration, and even young adults looking to learn from those who had faced life's toughest battles with grit and grace. Frank was overwhelmed, humbled, and energized. Each message was a reminder that his journey was not just about him, it was part of a larger story of reinvention and resilience. One evening, as Frank typed a response to a woman named Carol, who had recently started painting after losing her husband, he paused and reflected on how far he had come. Just months before, the idea of sharing his life so openly would have felt impossible. Now, the vulnerability was a strength, a bridge connecting hearts and healing wounds. Inspired by Elon Musk's ability to harness technology to change the world, Frank began exploring ways to expand his message. He started hosting weekly live-stream chats, inviting guests who were living proof that age was no barrier to new beginnings. A retired engineer who had designed medical devices, a grandmother who launched a successful podcast, a former athlete turned community organizer, all shared stories of courage and transformation. These conversations brought fresh energy to the community and gave Frank a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't just about his rocket anymore, it was about empowering others to find their own launch pads. Frank also began volunteering at the local senior center, leading workshops on goal setting, digital literacy, and creative expression. Watching the hesitant faces of those unsure if they could change, he saw reflections of his own doubts and fears. But with every small breakthrough, a senior learning to navigate email, a woman sharing her first poem in decades, Frank felt the contagious power of hope. One afternoon, a young journalist from a regional magazine came to interview Frank about his journey and the community he had built. The resulting article painted a picture of a man who had taken control of his narrative, challenging stereotypes about aging with quiet determination and raw honesty. The story resonated deeply, drawing new followers to Frank's blog and live streams. Even Elon Musk's own social media account shared the article, calling it a powerful reminder that innovation isn't just about technology, it's about human spirit at every age. That recognition stunned Frank, making the rocket in his garage feel like a small part of something much larger. The ripple effect of his journey had turned into a wave, inspiring people to reclaim their power and rewrite their stories. But Frank knew the path was never without obstacles. There were still moments when loneliness crept in, when the aches of aging reminded him of his limitations, when the world's impatience with the elderly stung like a cold wind. Yet, in those moments, the community he had nurtured became his anchor. Through shared stories, encouragement, and laughter, they reminded each other that no one was truly alone. Frank's relationship with Lisa continued to evolve, too. Their conversations grew deeper, filled with mutual respect and understanding. Lisa began attending some of the live stream sessions, amazed at the impact her father's story had on so many. She even suggested collaborating on a project to help other families reconnect after years of distance. Together, they envisioned a digital platform where stories of late-life transformation could be shared, celebrated, and supported. As Frank looked out over the horizon from his porch one crisp morning, he felt a profound gratitude. What had begun as a quiet struggle in a forgotten garage had become a movement, one that honored the strength, wisdom, and potential of those society often overlooked. Frank realized that Elon Musk's influence went beyond the rockets and the headlines. It was about the courage to defy limits and imagine new possibilities. And in embracing that courage, Frank had not only transformed his own life but had ignited a beacon for others to follow. The ripple effect was still growing, and Frank was ready to keep pushing the boundaries of what aging could mean. For him, and for all those who dared to dream, the journey was just beginning. Frank had never been one to seek attention. Most of his life had been lived quietly, working hard, doing what was expected, and never making too much noise. But ever since the first rocket test, and especially after his story had gone public, something had shifted in how people looked at him, and how he looked at himself. He no longer felt invisible, but the attention brought with it a new pressure, a heaviness that clung to him when the cameras were gone, when the inbox was quiet, and the garage echoed with the stillness of early morning. One morning, just before dawn, Frank sat alone at his kitchen table, staring into the half-light with a cup of black coffee steaming between his hands. He had spent the previous night reading messages from readers, many of them inspiring, yes, but others heartbreaking. Stories of people who had no family left, no energy, no money, or who had tried to change and been crushed by life anyway. It hurt to read them, and for the first time since his own reinvention began, Frank felt overwhelmed by guilt. Who was he to inspire anyone? He hadn't cured cancer, launched rockets into space, or pulled a family out of poverty. He was just a man who got tired of sitting alone in the dark and decided to build a rocket because he didn't know what else to do with his grief. Was that really enough? As the sun broke over the trees, washing the kitchen in soft light, Frank wrestled with a growing feeling that maybe all he had done was paint over the cracks of a broken system. Society still sidelined older people. People still died with dreams unspoken. What difference did it make that one man had found his footing if millions were still falling? He shook his head, trying to brush away the thoughts, but they clung like fog. That day, he didn't go into the garage. He didn't write a blog post. He didn't walk his usual morning loop around the block. Instead, he sat with the weight of it all, years of being overlooked, memories of things unsaid, regrets that sometimes still reached for him in the middle of the night. He thought about Susan. How she'd always seen the best in him, even when he couldn't see it himself. He remembered how she used to say, "We don't have to change the world, Frank. Just change the world for one person." It had sounded sweet at the time. Now, it felt like a directive he'd forgotten. Later that afternoon, he finally stood up and walked into the garage, more slowly than usual. The rocket stood tall on the bench, finished, polished, perfect in its way. But Frank didn't look at it like he used to. Not with the same awe or sense of victory. He saw it now for what it really was, a symbol, yes, but not the finish line. The work wasn't done just because the rocket flew. The real work, the harder work, was staying open. Staying connected. Staying real. That evening, instead of writing about progress or victories, Frank sat down and typed something different. He titled the blog post, "The Days That Feel Heavy," and began with one sentence, "I don't always feel like I'm winning." He wrote about the doubts, the guilt, the weight of being seen as a symbol when sometimes he still felt like a broken man glued back together with hope and duct tape. He wrote about how it hurt to read people's pain, how helpless he sometimes felt. And then he wrote about Susan, and her words, and how he was trying to remember that the goal wasn't perfection or glory or viral attention, it was connection. If one person sees this and feels less alone, then it matters, he wrote at the end. He hesitated before hitting publish. But then he remembered Elon Musk's quote, "Some people don't like change, but you need to embrace change if the alternative is disaster." And maybe silence was the disaster. Maybe pretending everything was okay all the time was the real betrayal. So he clicked post. What happened next surprised even him. The comments flooded in faster than usual, not just the typical admiration, but genuine, vulnerable responses. People thanking him for being honest. For showing that reinvention wasn't a straight line. For proving that even the strong stumble sometimes. One message came from a man in Iowa named Raymond, age 73, who had kept quiet his whole life about feeling irrelevant after retirement. He wrote, "Your post gave me permission to feel what I've been trying not to. And now I think I'm ready to start something too." Frank sat back in his chair, stunned. The silence had broken. And in breaking it, something stronger had emerged, not admiration, but solidarity. That night, Lisa called. "I read your post," she said. I cried. There was a long pause. "I didn't know you still felt like that sometimes. I just thought you were past it." Frank exhaled slowly. "I don't think we ever get past it completely," he said. "We just learn to walk with it." Lisa was quiet, then said softly, "I'm glad you shared it. I think it helped me understand you better. And maybe understand myself a little too." In that moment, Frank realized something that no rocket could teach him. True legacy wasn't just about being remembered. It was about being real. Being present. Being brave enough to say, "This is hard," and inviting others to walk beside you anyway. The next morning, Frank returned to the garage. He didn't go to work on the rocket. He went to hang a framed photo of Susan above the bench, right beside a quote he had printed out from one of Elon Musk's early interviews. People work better when they know what the goal is and why. It is important that people look forward to coming to work in the morning and enjoy working. Frank looked up at her photo and smiled. "I know the goal now," he whispered. "It's not about rockets. It's about people." And with that, the heaviness lifted, just a little. Enough to take the next step. Enough to keep building, not just rockets, but a life that mattered, one honest word at a time. It was a quiet Sunday morning, the kind that came with no rush, no demands, only the soft creaking of the house and the rustle of leaves outside Frank's window. Autumn had begun to wrap itself around the town like an old quilt, painting the trees in deep reds and golds. Frank sat with a second cup of coffee in hand, staring at the framed photo of Susan above the workbench, his mind drifting. The heaviness from the days before had softened, not gone completely, but no longer paralyzing. He'd opened a door by writing that vulnerable post. Maybe not just for others, but for himself, too. Something about telling the truth had steadied him. He now understood that strength didn't always look like confidence. Sometimes it looked like being willing to feel everything and keep going anyway. His phone buzzed gently on the table. A message from Lisa. "Any plans today?" He smiled and typed back, "Just the usual." "Why?" Her reply was almost immediate. "Thinking of coming down. Maybe we could go for a walk." Frank stared at the screen for a moment, surprised. It had been months since she last visited in person. He texted back a simple, "Would love that." He felt something shift in his chest, something warm and almost painful. Like a bridge being rebuilt, slow and careful, but finally steady enough to cross. That afternoon, when Lisa arrived, Frank greeted her with a cautious hug, the kind where two people remember they're still learning how to be close again. She brought coffee and a bag of old photographs she'd found while cleaning out her storage closet. They sat together at the kitchen table, flipping through decades in their hands, birthdays, cookouts, trips to the lake, awkward teenage grins, Susan's unmistakable smile in nearly every shot. She always had this look, Lisa said, holding up a photo where Susan stood beside a much younger Frank, both of them covered in sawdust from some unfinished home project. Like she already knew how things would turn out, and she was okay with it. Frank chuckled softly. She saw more in us than we saw in ourselves. Still does. Lisa looked at him, her eyes a little misty. I've been reading more of your blog lately. I didn't know you had that much inside you. I guess. I just thought you were fine all these years. That you didn't really feel much after Mom died. You never talked about it. Frank looked down at his hands. I didn't know how. For a long time, I thought grief was something you had to carry in silence, especially as a man. Be strong. Keep moving. But silence just turns into distance, and distance turns into loneliness. Lisa reached across the table and touched his hand. I think I carried a lot of silence, too. About you. About me. I didn't know how to come back. I thought maybe I'd left it too long. Frank squeezed her hand gently. You didn't. You're here now. Later, they took a walk through the neighborhood, fallen leaves crunching under their shoes. The town looked different with Lisa beside him, more alive, somehow. They passed a group of neighborhood kids riding bikes, and one boy yelled out, "Hey! That's Rocket Man!" Lisa burst out laughing. Rocket Man? Frank shook his head, a little embarrassed. Local nickname now, apparently. I guess word got around. Well, she grinned, I've never been prouder to be Rocket Man's daughter. As they walked, Frank told her about the senior center, the live stream chats, the new connections he'd made. He even mentioned the email from Elon Musk's team, just a brief note of acknowledgement and a thank you for sharing the article that had gone viral. You got an email from Elon Musk? Lisa's eyes widened. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Didn't want to make a big deal of it, he shrugged. It was just a line or two. But still, it meant something. Like the world had noticed. Like maybe I was finally part of the future again. Lisa stopped walking and looked at him. You are, Dad. More than most people I know. That night, after Lisa had driven back home, Frank sat on his porch again. He stared up at the stars, the same stars he'd looked at as a boy, full of wonder, and the same ones he and Susan used to point out together during late-night talks. Somewhere out there, Elon's rockets were orbiting the Earth. Technology he'd dreamed about as a kid now circling overhead in real time. Frank thought about the people in his blog community, the ones who had started building, writing, speaking, painting, reconnecting. People who had been convinced it was too late, only to discover that maybe the end of one chapter was the opening sentence of the next. He thought about how quickly life could change, not just through tragedy, but through courage. He remembered a line Musk had said during one of his early talks, I think it's possible for ordinary people to choose to be extraordinary. Frank had never considered himself extraordinary. Not when he worked the factory line. Not when he lost Susan. Not when the house went quiet and the phone stopped ringing. But maybe being extraordinary wasn't about accolades or accomplishments. Maybe it was about daring to show up again. About building a rocket in your garage because it reminded you that dreams still mattered. About telling the truth. About walking the same neighborhood path with your daughter and realizing the distance between you had quietly disappeared. In the days that followed, Frank began outlining something new. A book, maybe. Not a technical manual or a memoir, but a guide, something like The Late Bloomer's Manifesto. A blend of stories, encouragement, and action steps for people in the second half of life who didn't want to feel invisible anymore. He wasn't sure who would publish it. Didn't matter. He'd self-publish it if he had to. He just knew it needed to exist. It wasn't enough to just be a symbol. He wanted to create tools. Real help. A roadmap through the fog. The first line he typed read, "This is not the end of your story. This is your ignition sequence." The ripple was turning into a wave. And Frank, once written off, once written down, once nearly forgotten, was now writing the next chapter. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever looked at the clock and thought they had run out of time. For everyone who still had fire in their chest, if only someone would hand them the match. And this time, Frank wasn't alone. He had a community, a mission, and a daughter who had found her way back to him. The bridges were holding strong. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank never expected to be standing on a stage again, not at his age, not under lights, and certainly not with a microphone clipped to his shirt. Yet here he was, palms slightly damp, heart tapping against his ribs like it hadn't in years. The room wasn't huge, maybe 100 people, maybe more, but the buzz in the air was electric. It wasn't the kind of crowd gathered for entertainment or spectacle. It was something quieter, more sacred, a gathering of people seeking permission to start again. The community center had organized it, a local, reinvention summit, inspired, unbelievably, by the blog Frank had started just 10 months earlier. He was the closing speaker. At first, he tried to say no. He wasn't a professional, not a coach, not an influencer. But the event organizer, a sharp-eyed woman named Tara who had once been a school principal before retirement, had looked him straight in the eyes and said, "You don't need a degree to tell the truth, Frank. You just need the guts to do it." So here he stood, his notebook in his pocket, blinking under warm lights. He looked out at the crowd. Men and women with silver hair, tired eyes, hopeful hearts. Some came in wheelchairs. Some were with adult children. Some sat alone in the back with arms crossed, the way he used to when he didn't want anyone to see how much he was hurting. He cleared his throat, leaned into the mic, and began. "A year ago, I didn't think I had anything left to say," he said. "I thought I was finished. Not in the dramatic sense, just in the quiet way life makes you feel invisible after a while. I had lost my wife, my daughter was growing distant, and I was fading. And then something happened." He paused. "I saw a rocket." There were a few chuckles, some curious glances. "Not a real one, not yet," he smiled. "I saw Elon Musk talking about the future. About going to Mars. About building a ship that could carry humans across space. And I thought, I'm 67 years old. My ship has sailed. But that night, something changed. I pulled a box out of my garage, an old rocket I'd started building when I was young. And I finished it. Not because I thought it would change the world. But because I needed to remember that I could still build something." A hush fell over the crowd. Frank could feel the stillness, the listening. What happened next surprised me. I started writing. Started walking. Started reaching out. And people started writing back. Hundreds. Then thousands. People just like me. Who felt too old, too broken, too late. But it wasn't too late. It never was. We just forgot how to say yes to ourselves. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metal fin from the original rocket he'd launched in the field. "This is a piece of the first rocket I finished. It didn't go far. Maybe 50 feet. But when I watched it lift, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Not pride. Not glory. Something simpler. Like I mattered again." He looked across the room. "And I want to tell you, you matter. You're not done. Not if you don't want to be." Someone in the back wiped their eyes. Frank continued. "I've heard people say, I missed my chance. But chances don't expire. We just stop looking for them. Age doesn't mean you're finished. It means you have more experience, more stories, more wisdom to offer. That's not a weakness. That's your launch fuel. He talked about Susan. About losing her. About the silence that came after. And about the day he told the truth on his blog, that he didn't feel strong, that he didn't feel like a symbol. He felt like a man trying not to drown in memory. And how that post had changed everything. Not because it was poetic or polished, but because it was real. We live in a world that tells us to hide our struggles. Especially as we get older. They want us quiet. Tidy. Grateful. But you don't have to disappear to be dignified. You don't have to be silent to be respected. You have every right to speak, to create, to try something new, even if it scares the hell out of you. There was light applause now. Nods. People leaning forward. Frank continued, voice steady, rising. I'm not here because I'm special. I'm here because I stopped waiting for permission. And that's what I want to give you, not advice, not motivation. Just permission. To build. To break. To begin. To reach out to the people you've been too afraid to call. To write that book. To learn how to use your phone. To tell your story. To say, I'm still here. I still matter. The applause swelled, not loud, but long. Sustained. And when it faded, Frank stepped back from the mic, breath a little ragged, eyes wet. He wasn't used to being heard. But he was starting to believe he had something worth saying. After the event, people came up to him, one by one. Some hugged him. Some just nodded, their eyes telling him more than words ever could. One man, in a worn baseball cap, said, I lost my wife last year. Haven't talked to my son in 5. But I'm going to call him. After tonight. I think I can. A woman in her 70s whispered, I used to sing, you know. In my 20s. Gave it up when the kids came. But maybe I'll sing again. Even if no one listens but me. That night, back at home, Frank sat on the porch and looked up at the stars again. Same sky. Same silence. But now it was filled with possibility. The ripple had turned into a voice that carried. Across state lines. Across generations. Across time. Frank knew the work wasn't over. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what came next. He was building something, not just for himself, but for everyone who thought they had missed their window. And he would keep showing up. Keep telling the truth. Keep lighting the match. Because someone, somewhere, was still waiting for their ignition. And if Frank's voice could help spark that, then maybe that was the legacy that mattered most. The morning after the summit felt different, not louder, not brighter, but deeper. As if the air itself carried more meaning. Frank woke up earlier than usual, the kind of early where the sky was still debating whether to rise. He padded quietly to the kitchen, poured himself a cup of black coffee, and stood by the window as steam curled into the cold glass. His reflection stared back, older, yes, but no longer faded. There was color in his face again, a stillness in his eyes that looked like purpose. The summit had changed something inside him. It hadn't given him a new dream, not exactly, it had reminded him he was allowed to keep dreaming. More than that, he had a responsibility now, not in the burdensome sense, but in the way a firekeeper feels about flame. He'd been handed something, voice, momentum, presence, and it wasn't his to hoard. It was meant to be passed on, shared, kindled into others. He opened his laptop, still half in shadow, and began typing a new blog post. No title yet, just a line that had been floating in his mind since the night before. What if your second life is the one you were always meant to live? He paused, fingers hovering above the keys, remembering how uncertain he had once felt. Just months ago, he was sitting in the same chair, scrolling through old space documentaries and wondering if Elon Musk had ever doubted himself. Wondering if the fear of irrelevance faded when you built rockets, or if maybe that fear never really left, even at the top. Maybe it wasn't about eliminating doubt. Maybe it was about learning to carry it. He typed on, not polishing, not editing, just telling the truth. He wrote about what it felt like to stand in front of a room full of people who were still deciding if they mattered. About how courage sometimes looks like showing up when you'd rather stay invisible. About the woman who told him she might sing again, and the man in the ball cap who was going to call his son. He ended with a simple call: what's one thing you haven't done because you thought it was too late? Go do it. Or take the first step. The re-entry burn is tough, but the landing is worth it. He hit publish. Closed the laptop. Took a deep breath. Re-entry. That word stayed with him all day. It was a space term, of course. After a spacecraft leaves orbit, it must survive the intense heat of re-entering Earth's atmosphere. It's dangerous. It's loud. Things shake. There's fire. But if the ship holds together, it makes it home. He felt like he was in re-entry now, coming back into a world he had floated above for years. Not absent, just disconnected. Now everything felt closer, sharper. Lisa's voice, the warmth of the sun on his skin, the chatter of kids outside, the smell of the neighbor's fireplace. The texture of life. For years it had dulled. Now it shimmered. He went to the garage and looked at the second rocket. Bigger than the first, more ambitious. He hadn't built it for performance, it was meant for a community launch event he was planning with the local school. But standing in front of it now, Frank realized something: he wanted to launch it himself. Not just symbolically. Really. He wanted to take it higher than the first. And not alone this time. With people. With stories. With support. He picked up his phone and texted Lisa, "What do you think about building a rocket together?" Her reply came back almost instantly: "Always wanted to be an astronaut. When do we start?" They spent the next week side by side in the garage. Lisa drove down every other day after work, and on weekends they stayed late, music playing, tools clinking, laughter echoing against the walls. It was slow work. Lisa didn't have much experience, but Frank taught her, step by step, just as he'd taught himself years ago. She asked questions, cracked jokes, and sometimes just sat silently beside him, hands busy, eyes focused. There was something healing in the rhythm of building together. One afternoon, they took a break and sat on the back porch, sipping iced tea. "You know," Lisa said, "when I was a kid, I used to think you were made of stone. You never cried. Never wavered. I thought that was what strength looked like." Frank nodded slowly. "That's what I thought too. For a long time. But strength, it changes. Now I think it's about staying soft even when life tries to harden you." She looked at him, her eyes tired but alive. "You're different now." "You too," he said. "I guess we both had to go through a little re-entry." That night, Frank lay awake in bed, thinking. Not with worry this time. With anticipation. Possibility. The world no longer felt like something he was aging out of, it felt like something he was stepping into again, with both feet. Like he'd been gone somewhere, and now he was back. The following week, he pitched an idea to the community center. A program, led by him and Lisa, called Project Second Launch. A mix of workshops, support groups, creative sessions, and storytelling events, specifically for people 60 and older who wanted to start something new. A business. A blog. A podcast. A letter to someone they hadn't spoken to in years. The idea was simple: support reinvention through action. Don't just talk about change, build it, fly it, fail at it, try again. The center approved it immediately. Within days, sign-ups poured in. Veterans. Retired nurses. Widows. Divorced men who hadn't held a paintbrush in decades. One man named Reggie, 82, said he wanted to learn how to live stream so he could share his gospel songs with his grandkids who lived 3 states away. Another woman, Doris, said she wanted to learn how to build furniture with her hands. "I spent 40 years working in a call center," she said. "Never touched a piece of wood. But now I want to make a rocking chair." Frank and Lisa began planning the sessions, creating guides, buying supplies. Elon Musk had once said, "If something is important enough, you should try, even if the probable outcome is failure." Frank carried that quote in his wallet now, not because he wanted to preach ambition, but because he believed in effort. In choosing to begin, even when the finish line is unclear. The day of the first project's second launch meeting, Frank stood in front of a room full of people who were nervous, excited, unsure. He held up a small model of his first rocket and said, "This is what I built when I didn't know if I mattered anymore. I built it to prove something to myself. That it's not too late. And neither is it for you." The room erupted in gentle applause. And then they began. Some with wood. Some with words. Some just sitting quietly, deciding they were allowed to dream again. Frank looked around and saw the future, not made of metal or fire, but of courage, connection, and the quiet decision to begin again. And in that moment, he knew, this was re-entry. Not a return to the past, but a return to purpose. A return to self. A return to life. It was a gray Thursday afternoon when Frank stood in the community center gymnasium staring up at the banner they had just finished hanging. Project Second Launch, it's never too late to begin again. The word stretched across the room in bold blue and white letters, simple but powerful. Around him, tables were set with supplies, paints, journals, soldering kits, wood for carving, laptops, even a microphone and small speaker setup for those interested in podcasting. The buzz in the air was quiet but unmistakable. A different kind of energy. Not frantic like youth, but steady and determined, like a current just beneath the surface of calm water. The kind that could power something big. Frank had expected maybe a dozen people. 30 had signed up. 50 showed up. And they kept coming. Some brought grandkids. Some brought neighbors. One man walked in slowly with a cane and simply said, "I don't know what I'm doing here, but I think I'm supposed to be here." Frank smiled and guided him to a seat near the table labeled, "First Sparks, Finding Your Next Thing." Lisa stood at the front, clipboard in hand, greeting people as they walked in, checking names, handing out welcome packets with the project's second launch logo stamped in the corner. She looked like she belonged there, like she had always been a part of this. Watching her work, Frank felt a deep pride not just in her, but in the life they were now shaping together, not as father and child rehashing the past, but as partners building the future. The first session was called One Small Step. It wasn't about goal setting or 5-year plans. It was simpler than that. Each participant was asked one question: what is one thing you always wanted to do, but never gave yourself permission to try? The answers came slowly at first, guarded, hesitant. But then, like embers catching wind, the room lit up. Write a novel. Sail the Atlantic. Build a treehouse for my great-grandkids. Apologize to my brother. Make peace with myself. Frank nodded after each one, sometimes repeating them out loud. Not to affirm them, but to let them echo. To make them real. To say, "You said this. We heard you. Now let's go after it." He shared his story again, but this time less like a speaker and more like a peer. He talked about grief. About Susan. About the long nights and cold coffee and the way time had slowly smothered his fire until he decided to strike a match, not because he believed he could succeed, but because he couldn't live with not trying. He held up a model of his second rocket, the one he and Lisa had built together, now painted bright red with the word "Second Stage" written on the side. "The first stage gets you off the ground," he said. "But the second stage, that's what takes you higher. This program, these weeks ahead, they're your second stage. It doesn't matter how many years you've lived. You've got fuel left. The room went still. Some nodded. Some cried. Some sat straighter. They broke into smaller groups. Lisa led the writing circle, where people wrote letters to their younger selves. Reggie, the retired church singer, practiced speaking into a mic with trembling hands and a huge smile. Doris, the woman who wanted to make a rocking chair, held a piece of sandpaper like it was gold, smoothing the edge of a plank she'd measured herself. No one rushed. No one competed. It wasn't about results. It was about reawakening. Frank walked from table to table, checking in, offering help, listening more than he spoke. He saw something forming, community, yes, but also momentum. These people weren't just experimenting. They were claiming something. Reclaiming it. One woman named Margaret, who had been silent most of the afternoon, finally raised her hand and said, "Can I say something?" The room quieted. "I used to think I was past my prime," she said. "That life had already handed me everything it was going to give. But watching all of you today, I realized, maybe I'm just now arriving." The applause that followed wasn't polite. It was grateful. Affirming. A kind of collective exhale that said, yes. Exactly. That night, as Frank and Lisa packed up, she looked at him and said, "This is going to be bigger than we thought, isn't it?" Frank nodded. "Yeah. It already is." He sat on the edge of the stage for a moment, looking out at the now empty chairs, imagining all the lives that would sit there in the weeks to come, all the quiet revolutions waiting to be born. He thought about something Elon Musk had said in an old interview: persistence is very important. You should not give up unless you are forced to give up. Frank had almost given up, not because of failure, but because he thought he'd run out of time. And now he could see clearly, the only thing running out had been his belief. Belief that he was allowed to try again. Belief that he had anything left to offer. But now. Now he knew better. The next few weeks flew by in a blur of sawdust, laughter, old vinyl records playing on a borrowed turntable, shared sandwiches at break time, hesitant first steps, and brave new beginnings. People came early. Stayed late. The building took on a kind of sacredness, not because of what it was, but because of what it was allowing to happen. Transformation. Revival. Second ignition. Lisa surprised Frank with a printed draft of his new book. She'd formatted it herself, pulled pieces from the blog, added quotes, even included a section at the end called Voices from the Launchpad, full of stories from the participants. "We can self-publish it," she said, placing the proof copy in his hands. "It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be true." Frank turned the pages slowly. There it was. His voice, raw and real. Not cleaned up or poetic, but grounded. Human. Alive. He looked up at her. "You made this real." "No," she said. "You did. I just handed it back to you." They launched the book quietly, with no marketing budget, no fanfare. Just a post on his blog and a link. But word spread. Orders came in. Slowly, then faster. Messages poured in from readers across the country. One from a woman in Arizona who said she read the whole thing in one sitting and then finally applied to the ceramics class she'd been putting off for years. Another from a widower in Vermont who said he left it on his son's doorstep with a note, "Let's try again." Frank kept every message. Printed them out. Filed them in a folder labeled Proof of Life. The book wasn't just a book. It was a beacon. A flare. A reminder that you could still lift off, even with cracked wings. Especially with cracked wings. Because flight isn't about being flawless. It's about choosing air over stillness. Every single time. Frank woke before dawn, as he had for weeks now, with a restlessness that hummed through his bones, and not the kind born of duty or habit, but of fierce purpose. The world outside his window was still wrapped in quiet gray, the air thin and crisp, as though holding its breath for something new. He pulled on the same worn hoodie, coffee mug already heavy with the day's first brew, and made his way to the garage, where the second rocket, the cherry-red one painted second stage, waited quietly under a single swing light. Today was launch day. Not for the community project, not for a school demonstration, but for himself. He'd talked through the idea with Lisa over late-night cups of tea, two old souls, building a rocket together in a small town, aiming it skyward not for distance but for meaning. The plan was simple: launch it on a clear patch of land behind the community center field, with friends, neighbors, and participants gathered to witness something that felt impossible. As Frank tightened the last bolt, securing the fins, he remembered something Elon Musk had said: "When I started SpaceX I thought that the most likely outcome was failure. And I think to have any other expectation would have been irrational." That idea, expecting failure, preparing for it, and launching anyway, thumped in his heart like a drum. It wasn't arrogance that fueled him, it was honesty. He understood that to soar you have to accept that you might fall. He loaded the fuel and checked everything twice, the smell of gasoline sharp in the cold air. The crowd gathered at a safe distance, more than 100 people, some from the project's second launch sessions, some family, a few reporters following the local buzz, even one or two people who'd driven from neighboring towns after reading his blog. The tension was thick with hope. Lisa stood beside him, smartphone in hand, live-streaming the moment. Frank cleared his throat, voice steady though his heart raced. "Thank you, everyone, for being here," he said. "We're not expecting perfection. We're expecting bravery." He pointed to the sky. "We're launching today because the only flight worth having is the one you attempt." He looked at Lisa, she nodded, and he clicked the ignition button. Fire roared beneath the rocket's base, and it lifted off with a fierce flash, ascending into the pale sky, trailing smoke like a comet's tail. For a moment, time stopped. Then it arced, wobbled, straightened, and flared. It climbed higher than the first rocket, then lifted off the hill where expectations lived, and burst through the unseen ceiling that whispered, "It's too late." Cheers rose from the crowd, raw, unfiltered, alive. Frank closed his eyes and felt tears press at the edges. In that fire and flight, he saw not just a rocket, but years of fear and longing burning away. This was fire in the belly. This was purpose. Afterwards, people swarmed, hugging him, laughing, crying. One woman in her 70s wiped her glasses and said, "My art studio is waiting for me." A retired miner with soot under his fingernails told Frank he was going back to his old tools and making something real again. It echoed. A younger man, not much older than his daughter, clapped Frank on the shoulder and said, "You just gave me permission to begin again." Later that night, at home, Frank sat on the porch with Lisa, watching stars appear one by one above the hushed town. The rocket's glow was long gone, but its fire still echoed inside him. He thought of another Musk quote, that failure is an option here. If things are not failing, you are not innovating enough. He'd lived that truth, he'd invited failure, stitched himself together with it, and soared anyway. Lisa squeezed his hand. "So, what now?" Frank looked up, starlight in his eyes. "Now we keep going. We help others light their fire too." He pulled his laptop into his lap and began drafting the next chapter. A guide for igniting your own second stage, part memoir, part manifesto, part workshop series. He wrote late into the night, not because he had to, but because he couldn't not. The fire had lit something that would not go out. And whatever came next, books, programs, stories remembered, the launch had proved it, even at the end of your timeline, you can begin again. Frank didn't think much of the email when it first came through. He had been sorting through dozens of messages, some from readers who just finished the book, others from people looking to join Project's second launch. Most were filled with encouragement, some were confessions of long-held dreams, and a few were just thank yous for reminding them they weren't alone. But this one stood out. It was short, direct, and signed by someone whose name looked vaguely familiar. The subject line read, "A visit from SpaceX." At first, Frank assumed it was spam or a joke. Some weirdly targeted promotional gimmick or maybe a prank by someone who read the blog. But when he clicked it open and read the contents, he felt his heart slow in that strange, heavy way that happens when your mind can't yet comprehend what you're looking at. It was from a woman named Serena, a community engagement coordinator for SpaceX's outreach program. She had read his story. First through a tech blog that had reposted a section of his recent speech at the community center, then through his own site. She wrote, "We were moved, deeply, by the work you've done with Project Second Launch. Elon often says, we go to space to inspire life back on Earth. You've made that literal. We'd love to speak with you about a potential visit and collaborative event with our education and innovation team. Would you be open to a conversation?" Frank blinked at the screen. Read it again. Then again. He called Lisa. She didn't pick up. So he sat with the words for a long moment, the kind of moment where the past, present, and future all sit together at the same table, staring at you with quiet challenge. When Lisa finally called him back, he read the email aloud. She was silent for a beat, then said softly, "Dad, that's not small." No, it wasn't. Not at all. A week later, Frank was sitting in his small den on a video call with Serena and two members of the SpaceX outreach team. They asked thoughtful questions about his program, his goals, and what inspired him to build the rockets in the first place. He told them everything: the first launch in the backyard, the night spent watching old Falcon 9 videos, the grief that started it all, the way Elon's voice talking about Mars felt like someone daring the impossible to exist. Serena smiled warmly and said, "We're piloting a new public initiative focused on lifelong innovation. People often assume space exploration is only for the young, but space is about imagination. And imagination doesn't expire." Frank felt his throat tighten. He knew, more than anyone, what it meant to believe your imagination had an expiration date. "We'd like to invite you to speak at one of our upcoming Inspiration Days in Texas. Tour a facility, meet some of the engineers, maybe even see a live test." His breath caught. "You'd be willing to do that for someone like me?" Serena leaned closer to the camera. "Frank, you're doing the very thing we're trying to prove. That human potential doesn't end. You're not just part of the story, you're helping rewrite it." When the call ended, Frank sat back, stunned. Not because he had finally made it, or because SpaceX had taken notice. That wasn't what made him emotional. It was because the little fire he lit when he dusted off that old rocket had become a signal flare, and someone had seen it. Someone had looked up and said, "That light matters." A month later, Frank and Lisa boarded a flight to Texas. Neither of them had traveled in years. As the plane lifted, Frank looked out the window and whispered, "I wonder how far the second stage could really take us." Lisa smiled. "Farther than either of us thought." When they landed, a SpaceX driver met them at the airport with a simple sign that said, "Second Launch." Frank grinned at the poetry of it. At the SpaceX campus, they were led through hangars where components of rockets sat in massive assembly stages, metal giants that looked more like dreams than machines. Engineers in jumpsuits moved with quiet precision. Frank walked slowly, reverently, like he was in a cathedral of futures. One of the guides, a young woman named Mira, paused beside him and said, "Most of the people who work here started dreaming about space before they knew how taxes worked. But we forget that the older we get, the more reasons we have to want to reach for something higher." She smiled. "Thanks for reminding us." During his talk that afternoon, Frank stood in front of a room filled with engineers, students, and public guests. He held up the small fin from his first rocket, the one he had launched alone in a field with shaky hands. "This," he said, "is where my second life began. It didn't start with strategy or a business plan. It started with pain. And from that pain, something lifted. Not high. Not for long. But high enough to change me. He spoke about regret, about age, about being 67 and realizing he still had fuel in the tank. We talk a lot about the limits of physics. But the real limits are the ones we put on ourselves. The room was quiet when he finished. Not still, charged. People clapped slowly, then louder. Lisa wiped her eyes. A man in the front row stood and said, "I hope I still have half your fire when I'm your age." Frank smiled. "You will. Just don't let the world put it out." Later, as they walked the grounds, Mira pulled him aside and handed him a sealed envelope. "Elon asked me to give you this," she said. Frank took it, hands trembling just slightly. Inside was a single card, thick stock, black and silver. It read, "You proved what we've always believed, space isn't just out there. It's within. Keep launching." Elon, there was no signature, but it didn't matter. The message had weight. And more importantly, it had truth. That night, back in the hotel, Frank and Lisa sat on the balcony, the Texas sky wide and unending above them. Neither said much. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer filled with history or regret. It was filled with expansion. Possibility. A kind of quiet that waits for the next ignition. Frank finally said, "You know what I think?" Lisa turned to him. "What?" "This is just the beginning. Not of something flashy or famous. But something real. Something that can last." She nodded. "A legacy." He shook his head. "No. Not a legacy. A chain reaction." She smiled, leaned against his shoulder. And together, they watched the stars, not for what they had lost, but for what they were still becoming. The weeks following the SpaceX visit felt like a return to Earth, but not in the way Frank feared. It wasn't a crash landing. It was more like orbit settling, familiar, but elevated. The work continued, the blog expanded, and Project Second Launch was growing faster than either he or Lisa had expected. They now had chapters in 4 states, small pockets of retirees and empty nesters forming circles of support and action, igniting late-life creativity like campfires across the country. People were emailing daily to ask how they could start one in their town. "It's like we accidentally built a movement," Lisa said one night as they sat in Frank's living room, surrounded by printed letters, applications, and homemade thank you cards. Frank laughed, tired but energized. "Accidentally? I think we just finally gave people permission to want more. That's all they were waiting for." There was truth in that. The culture they'd grown up in told them that ambition was for the young, that starting over after 60 was either foolish or delusional. But now there were 72-year-olds launching podcasts, 68-year-olds learning AI art tools, 81-year-olds starting YouTube channels about woodworking, cooking, or telling stories from their childhoods. And it wasn't about virality. It wasn't about money. It was about having a reason to wake up in the morning that didn't revolve around just surviving another day. The initiative got press, first local, then national. One segment aired on a Sunday morning news show featuring a short interview with Frank in the garage beside his first rocket. The interviewer asked, "Did you ever imagine any of this?" Frank looked into the camera and said, "No. I imagined dying quietly, maybe with a few regrets and some faded memories. But now, I think I'm going out in a blaze of purpose." The clip went viral. Comments poured in from all over the world. But Frank stayed grounded. That was Lisa's phrase, ground control. She started using it whenever they felt overwhelmed by attention or momentum. "We need ground control," she'd say. "We're not celebrities. We're caregivers for courage." And Frank agreed. They weren't in this to become famous. They were in it to multiply the message. Still, even Frank had to admit it was surreal when invitations came from places he never thought he'd step into: innovation labs, retirement communities in Silicon Valley, even a college that wanted him to guest lecture on late-life systems disruption. But one letter stopped him cold. It came in a plain envelope, hand-addressed, with no return name. Inside was a single page written in neat script. Frank, your story found me. I'm 64. I buried my husband last year. Since then I've mostly just wandered the house trying to remember who I was before all this. Then I saw you build that rocket. And something came alive again. Not big. Not dramatic. Just a small breath where there had been silence. Yesterday I signed up for a community welding course. Not because I want to be a welder. But because I want to feel fire in my hands again. Thank you for reminding me I'm not done yet. Patricia. Frank held that letter for a long time. Not because it surprised him, but because it reminded him that every moment of doubt, every quiet night alone in that garage, had been building toward this. He read it aloud to Lisa, who quietly whispered, "There are thousands more like her." And she was right. So they got to work. They built out an official Project Second launch website, added toolkits for people to start their own groups, launched a podcast together called The Second Stage, and started traveling once a month to visit chapters, speak at libraries, and meet the people behind the letters. The road trips became rituals. Frank and Lisa in his old pickup, a thermos of coffee between them, classic rock humming low from the speakers, and maps marked with little stars where transformation was quietly taking root. They laughed more now. Argued less. Spoke easily. Sometimes Frank would catch himself watching Lisa from the driver's seat and feel a wave of something almost too big to name. Pride, yes. But more than that, relief. That she didn't give up on him. That they had found a way back. One evening, after a talk in Portland, a young man approached them. Maybe 25. Nervous. Said his mom had been part of the first Project Second launch group and had passed away recently, but not before finishing the novel she had started when she was 19. She said you gave her that final spark, he said, tears barely held back. Thank you. For giving me my mom back before I had to let her go. Frank hugged him, no words. There weren't any good enough. That night in the hotel, Lisa looked at him and said, "You know what Elon would say right now?" Frank chuckled. That we're not thinking big enough. Exactly, she grinned. Dad, what if we built a permanent space? A center. Not just online chapters and libraries and blog posts. A real place. Somewhere people can go. A headquarters for second launches. Frank raised an eyebrow. You mean like, a school? More like a spaceport, Lisa said. A launch pad. With workshops, mentors, maybe even a studio. Classes. A rocket garden. A place where nobody's too old to try again. Frank sat back, overwhelmed, but in the best way. The idea was wild. Expensive. Ridiculous. Beautiful. Possible. That night he wrote in his journal, "The fire is spreading. And we owe it to the flame to build a home for it." Over the next month, they began the hunt for a location. Something modest, near their town, with land and space to build. A decommissioned school on the edge of the county stood out. Old but solid. Overgrown but full of light. They toured it, just the two of them, imagining classrooms becoming studios, offices turning into dream rooms, the auditorium transformed into a launch gallery where models of participants' creations would be displayed. They walked the cracked gymnasium floor in silence. Lisa finally said, "Can you see it?" Frank nodded. "Yeah. I really can." They put in a bid. Started a fundraiser. Called in every favor, every connection. Frank reached out to Serena at SpaceX, who offered to sponsor some equipment and even send volunteers once it was up and running. Local businesses pledged support. Former students of Frank's began offering donations, old workshop tools, laptops, paint. Within 3 months, it was theirs. The ribbon-cutting ceremony drew hundreds. Frank stood at the podium, Lisa beside him, the crowd filled with locals, reporters, and dozens of people whose lives had been transformed by the project. "We call this a launch center," Frank said, "because it's not a place to land. It's a place to rise. Whether you're 60 or 90, you belong here. Because you're still in orbit. You're still becoming. And the only thing more powerful than a second chance, is giving one." When they unveiled the name, the crowd gasped, clapped, and some cried. It was etched into metal above the main entrance, the Frank Wilson Center for Second Launches. Frank turned to Lisa, overwhelmed. "You named it after me?" She smiled. "No. We named it after the fire you started." That night, they sat outside on the front steps of the building as the stars emerged above. Not reaching for them. Not chasing them. Just resting under them, knowing they'd done something that would last longer than rockets, longer than headlines. They'd given the world a place to believe again. Frank had expected the grand opening of the Frank Wilson Center for Second Launches to feel like a culmination, like the final line of a long story. But what he felt, standing in the main hallway the following morning with a fresh cup of coffee and the echo of yesterday's cheers still ringing faintly in his ears, wasn't closure. It was ignition. He walked the halls slowly, letting his hand graze the smooth walls that had once been chipped and covered in graffiti but now gleamed with light paint and hope. Volunteers had worked around the clock to get everything ready, woodshop benches newly installed, a tech lab with refurbished laptops blinking softly on a long table, a quiet room filled with books and soft chairs where people could sit and think or write or simply exist without the world demanding anything of them. A wide chalkboard stretched across one wall with the heading, "Your Next Launch," written in bold, hand-drawn letters. Beneath it, names had already begun to appear. Carol, painting again after 35 years. Reggie, my first podcast. Tomiko, forgiving myself. Each one like a flare in the night sky, signaling not only intent, but courage. Lisa joined him just as he reached the rocket gallery. She held a clipboard and wore the same tired but thrilled expression he had seen on her face since the first batch of welcome kits went out the week before. 30 new sign-ups overnight, she said. 2 more groups requested toolkits. One guy in Wisconsin wants to start a center in his town. Retired mechanical engineer. Says he's got the building and just needs the spark. Frank took a deep breath. That's what we're here for. They stood together for a moment, watching as an older woman in a lavender cardigan walked into the rocket gallery and gasped when she saw the replica of Frank's first rocket hanging from the ceiling. "Is that the one from your backyard?" she asked. Frank nodded. "The very one." She turned to him with tears in her eyes. "My husband died 2 years ago. We had dreams when we were young. Most of them got lost along the way. But this place, it makes me think maybe I've still got one left." Frank put a hand over his heart. "You do. We all do." Over the coming weeks, the center became more than a building. It became a movement's home base. Local news stations began calling it, the NASA for late bloomers, a phrase that made Frank chuckle and cringe in equal measure. But the truth behind it was hard to ignore. People were showing up, some by car, some on foot, one man even hitchhiked from 2 towns over. They came not for the facilities or the free coffee, but for the permission. The permission to be seen again. To try again. To want again. One man named Harold, 83, with hands that trembled from Parkinson's, showed up to a workshop called Making with Memory. It was a simple course meant to help people recreate something from their youth. Harold brought in a rusted harmonica and said, "I played this for my wife on our first date. I haven't touched it since she passed 10 years ago." With guidance and patience, he relearned 3 songs and performed one on the last day of the workshop. The sound wasn't perfect. But it was beautiful. Raw. Honest. Alive. Another woman, Marcy, had been a silent presence at nearly every event. Widowed. No children. Had worked 40 years as a librarian and then simply faded into retirement. She started sitting in on the storytelling workshops, then started writing. Not blogs or essays, but letters. Dozens of them. To people she'd never met. Letters that began with lines like, "I don't know your name, but I know how it feels to be alone on a Sunday," or, "Maybe you forgot who you are. Let me remind you." Lisa read one of them aloud during a team meeting. By the end, everyone was crying. They decided to include Marcy's letters in every welcome packet going forward. She became the center's quiet poet laureate. Elon's presence, while never direct, remained a constant inspiration. Quotes were now etched into plaques in each room. One read, "Some people don't like change, but you need to embrace change if the alternative is disaster." Another, "Persistence is very important. You should not give up unless you are forced to give up." Frank would sometimes walk the halls late at night when the center was empty, reading the quotes to himself like prayers, remembering that it was one unexpected video clip, one sentence from a man who refused to stop dreaming, that lit the fuse of his own resurrection. Then came the call that changed everything again. It was from a documentary filmmaker based in Los Angeles who had been following the story since the SpaceX event. She wanted to produce a full-length feature on Frank, the center, and the movement it had sparked. "I'm not interested in a puff piece," she said during the initial call. "I want to explore what it really means to start over when the world says you're finished." Frank hesitated. "This isn't about me," he said. "Exactly," she replied. "That's why it's worth filming." They began production 3 weeks later. Cameras captured the workshops, the quiet moments, the breakthroughs and breakdowns. They followed Frank and Lisa on one of their road trips, documenting the long silences between towns, the laughter over diner pie, the way they argued over directions but never over purpose. One scene showed Frank helping an 89-year-old man named Stanley install the last wheel on a Pinewood Derby car for his great-grandson. "I didn't get to do this with my own son," Stanley said, eyes glistening. "I thought I missed the chance forever." Frank held his shoulder. "You didn't. You're doing it now." When the documentary aired, first at small festivals, then later on a major streaming platform, it was titled Second Stage, The Life After the Life You Planned. It became a surprise hit. Not viral in a flashy way, but like a quiet wave that just kept coming. Viewers from around the world sent in letters, videos, emails. From Korea, Brazil, South Africa. People who'd believed they were too far gone. Too tired. Too late. And now they weren't. They were launching. One message from a 76-year-old woman in Finland simply said, "I started painting again. The canvas cried when I touched it." Another, from a man in Detroit, "You made me pick up the guitar my dad gave me in 1969. He died before I ever learned to play. I'm learning now." Frank couldn't read more than 2 or 3 at a time without breaking down. Lisa kept them organized, printing out the most powerful ones, pinning them to the wall of echoes at the center, a growing mosaic of global proof that late doesn't mean never. One afternoon, as Frank walked through the center's main hallway, he stopped by the chalkboard wall again. Dozens more names. More goals. More dreams. More fire. But one phrase stood out at the bottom, written in large, looping letters: "I was never too old. I was just waiting for permission to matter again." He stared at it for a long moment. Then took a piece of chalk, knelt down, and wrote beneath it in smaller letters, "You always mattered. We just needed a reminder." That night, as he and Lisa locked up, Frank turned to her, eyes full of something deeper than pride. "Do you think we'll ever know how far this goes?" She looked around the building, the walls humming with stories, the lights dimming one by one like stars winking into a quiet sky. "I think," she said, "it's already gone farther than we'll ever see." Frank nodded. Somewhere inside him, the rocket kept rising. Frank awoke before the dawn, not stirred by insomnia as once was his habit, but by a quiet certainty that today mattered. The early light spilled across his nightstand, falling on the ticket stub from his recent visit to SpaceX before landing on the framed letter from Elon Musk that sat beside it. He fingered the black and silver card. "You proved what we've always believed, space isn't just out there. It's within. Keep launching." Elon, and felt a deep surge of responsibility settle in his chest. This wasn't just his story anymore. It belonged to everyone who had found themselves again, who had dared to rebuild. Downstairs, the center hummed with life. Volunteers moved between rooms, tending to a sculpture class in progress, a live stream recording in the podcast booth, and a woodworking workshop in the back wing. In the hallway, a new poster read, "Legacy in Motion, Today We Launch Others." Frank walked through, offering quiet encouragement, "Tell her more about that idea. Perfect choice of paper for the playlist sleeve. Grip it gently, you'll get the rhythm back fast." He noticed the depth of focus on the faces around him, not just students but seekers, reawakening artists, craftsmen, parents reconnecting with children, men and women remembering who they used to be and discovering who they still were. He paused by the rocket gallery, where the Starship replica and his own original model hung side by side. A young woman stood studying them, her eyes thoughtful behind thick-rimmed glasses. "It's odd," she said, then turned to Frank. "I used to look at space and feel small. Like I didn't belong. But now, I see how big it is, and I realize I can belong, still." Frank smiled, the warmth of that truth filling him. "You already do." He moved on toward the large classroom, where today's session was about community projects, real, actionable ideas people could take back into their towns. Groups formed around building community gardens, starting memoir clubs, creating online spaces for late-life quotes, local history preservation projects. Ideas small and grand, practical and poetic, each one a spark from the smoldering embers of possibility. Lisa found him then, clipboard in hand, excitement in her eyes. "Frank, look at this," she said softly. Frank followed her gaze to a monitor displaying a live map. Tiny markers lit up across the country, new chapters of Project Second Launch forming in Maine, Texas, Michigan, Arizona, all based on the online toolkit he and Lisa had launched. "Did we really reach that many people?" he asked, disbelief in his voice. "You did," Lisa corrected, and squeezed his arm. "They just needed the match." A lull followed, and Frank stood at the head of the room, all eyes turning toward him. They gathered round as he cleared his throat, feeling the microphone's warmth underneath his shirt. The hush of anticipation was familiar now, not uncomfortable, but sacred. He began, "When I started building that rocket, I only thought I was starting something for myself. A small spark to prove I still mattered. But then people showed up. The unexpected invitations, the forgotten dreams, the art that was born again. And now, look at this room. Legacy in motion." He paused, letting it sink in. This isn't just about rockets. It's about giving people permission to matter. To try. To fail. To try again. And to take that second, or third or fourth, chance and make it real. Around him, the room glowed with unspoken affirmation, a mosaic of later-life artists, storytellers, sons and daughters reconnecting, dreamers no longer waiting. The day continued with workshops and shared meals and small speeches. But in the afternoon, they held something new, a moment called ignition circles. Each participant, if they chose, stepped into the center of a circle and spoke one sentence about their next step. A woodworker who had never cut a board, an aspiring painter, the man learning live streaming. Each spoke, and the group cheered, and notes went up on a large board. "Patricia, finish my first poem." "Reggie, publish my first podcast episode. Harold, share my harmonica song. Frank watched, heart full, as lives aligned toward possibility. That evening, as shadows stretched across the courtyard, Frank and Lisa walked the grounds in silence. The center's lights reflected in the glass of the Starship display, and the night air carried voices, soft laughter, turning pages, quiet encouragement. Lisa took his hand. "We built this," she said simply. "We started something bigger," Frank replied, voice hushed. "A legacy that's still moving." Later, when Frank lay in bed, he thought of the Starship's recent test flight that successfully survived re-entry heat and deployed payload, proof that iteration, failure, and courage could win the day. He thought of how cosmic re-entry mirrored human renewal, scorching, uncertain, but survivable with the right shield and a steady heart. And as sleep claimed him, he held on to one truth above all: legacies aren't monuments. They're motions, gentle beginnings that ripple outward, igniting lives long after a single voice first asked, "What if?" Frank woke to the sound of birds calling through an open window, the morning light filtering softly into his room. The quiet was different now, full of promise instead of emptiness. He sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and thought about how much his life had shifted since the Starship launch that had sparked everything. It wasn't just about rockets or space anymore. It was about people, their stories, their second chances, and the incredible ripple effect that one small spark could ignite. Downstairs, the center was already humming with activity. Frank poured himself a cup of coffee and made his way to the common room where a group had gathered around a table strewn with photos and letters. It was a new project called Echoes of Tomorrow, an initiative to collect and share stories from the center's members about what transformation meant to them. Frank joined the circle and listened as each person took turns reading aloud excerpts from their journals, their voices trembling with raw emotion. "I never thought I could start again after my wife left," said one man. "But here, I found a new purpose." A woman spoke next, her eyes shining. "This place gave me permission to dream in colors I'd forgotten." Frank felt a lump in his throat. These stories were the real legacy, more powerful than any rocket or accolade. They were proof that human spirit could overcome the weight of years, regret, and loss. Outside, a cool breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh rain, a reminder that renewal was a natural cycle, not a rare miracle. As the day unfolded, Frank moved from workshop to workshop, offering encouragement, sharing laughs, and watching as people built more than just projects, they built confidence and community. A retired teacher taught a class on storytelling. A former engineer led a session on digital skills for beginners. Children of all ages, brought by grandparents, explored space-themed crafts and listened wide-eyed to tales of exploration and perseverance. In the afternoon, Frank sat down with Lisa to review the latest update from their online platform. Thousands of people had now signed up for the Second Launch Toolkit, a collection of guides and exercises designed to help anyone reclaim lost dreams or start new ones regardless of age. Messages flooded in from across the country and beyond. A woman in Ohio wrote about rekindling her passion for gardening after decades away. A man in Florida sent photos of the birdhouse he built with his grandkids, calling it a symbol of new beginnings. These ripples of inspiration were spreading faster than Frank could have imagined. Lisa smiled at him across the table. "We've created something that's bigger than both of us," she said. "It's a movement now." Frank nodded, feeling a mix of pride and humility. "And it's only just beginning." That evening, Frank attended a community gathering hosted by the center. The room was packed with people of all ages, sharing food, stories, and music. A local band played songs about hope and resilience while others danced or simply swayed to the rhythm. Frank found himself talking to Harold, the 83-year-old who had relearned the harmonica. "You know," Harold said, his voice warm, "I never thought I'd be up here playing music again. But now, it feels like my soul has wings." Frank smiled, "You've always had them. You just needed to remember." The night air was cool as Frank stepped outside, gazing up at the stars glittering above. The vastness of space had once seemed intimidating, a reminder of his smallness and limitations. Now, it felt like a canvas waiting to be painted with stories of courage, reinvention, and connection. He thought of Elon Musk's words about embracing change and persistence. They weren't just about rockets, they were about life itself. Driving home, Frank reflected on how far he had come, from a lonely man haunted by regrets to a beacon for others seeking light in their own darkness. He realized that the ripple effect was unstoppable, fueled by the courage of each person who chose to take one more step, speak one more truth, or dream one more dream. It was a testament to the idea that it's never too late to launch again, no matter your age or past. As he prepared for bed, Frank wrote a new entry in his journal. Today, I saw the power of hope multiplied 1,000-fold. This is more than a center or a story, it's a legacy of second chances. And I'm honored to be part of it. Closing the book, he felt a deep peace settle over him, knowing that the journey of transformation was ongoing. Not just for him, but for everyone willing to believe that the next giant leap was always within reach. Frank's mornings had taken on a ritualistic calmness that contrasted sharply with the storm of change inside him. He would sit by his kitchen window, sipping coffee and watching the sun cast long shadows over the quiet neighborhood streets. The world outside moved steadily on, but inside the Frank Wilson Center for Second Launches, time felt different, as if it were expanding, allowing space for dreams long buried to breathe again. Today was no different, except for the knock at the door just after breakfast. It was Carol, the woman who had returned to painting after 35 years. She stood hesitantly on the threshold, carrying a canvas covered in cloth. "Frank," she said softly, "I want to show you something." He followed her to the gallery, the air heavy with anticipation. When she pulled back the cloth, there it was, a vibrant, swirling depiction of a rocket breaking through clouds, painted in bold strokes of red and gold. "It's my first since my husband passed," she explained. "I painted what it felt like to finally take off again." Frank looked at the painting, and something stirred deep inside him. It was more than art, it was a symbol, a quiet revolution of the spirit. For Carol, and for so many others, the center wasn't just a place. It was a declaration that life didn't end at retirement, illness, or loss. It was an invitation to fight against the quiet fading, the social invisibility that so many felt as they aged. It was about reclaiming purpose when the world said it was too late. As the day unfolded, Frank found himself in a series of conversations with newcomers, each carrying their own hesitations and hopes. A man named Reggie wanted to start a podcast sharing stories from veterans in his town. A woman named Tomiko planned to reconcile with her estranged daughter after a decade of silence. These weren't grand gestures in the world's eyes, but here, they were acts of bravery. Lisa came to him later with news from the documentary filmmaker. The film had been picked up for a wider release and was sparking discussions in community centers, retirement homes, and online forums nationwide. The quiet revolution Frank had helped ignite was spreading, challenging the narrative about aging and relevance. "People are finally seeing what we've always known," Lisa said. "That second chances aren't just possible, they're vital." That evening, the center hosted a panel discussion titled "Age is Not a Limit." Frank sat on the stage alongside several of the center's members who had transformed their lives. The room was packed, energy electric. When it was his turn to speak, Frank shared the moment that changed everything for him, a clip of Elon Musk talking about pushing boundaries no matter the odds. "It reminded me," Frank said, "that the biggest barrier isn't the years behind us, it's the doubts we carry inside." Questions followed, about fear, failure, and what it really meant to start over. Frank listened, answered, and sometimes simply nodded, knowing that the real work happened long after the spotlight faded. It was in the quiet moments, the daily choices to rise and try again. After the event, as the crowd dispersed into the cool night, Frank stood outside and looked up at the stars. The vastness seemed less daunting now, more a mirror of the potential inside each person who walked through the center's doors. He thought about Elon's relentless pursuit of the impossible and realized that the true legacy wasn't just rockets or Mars missions. It was the courage to challenge limitations, in space, in life, and in ourselves. Driving home, Frank felt a profound sense of connection. The quiet revolution was no longer just his fight. It was theirs, everyone who had chosen to defy expectation and reclaim their narrative. He smiled, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. Frank sat quietly in the now familiar space of his living room, the soft hum of the city outside mixing with the gentle ticking of the clock on the wall. He felt the weight of time in a way that was different now. Not as a burden, but as a tapestry woven with moments of struggle and triumph. The journey that began with a simple spark, a chance encounter with Elon Musk's bold vision for the future, had carried him further than he ever imagined. And yet, as he reflected, he realized the story wasn't about rockets or even about space. It was about something far more profound, the human capacity to begin again. The center had blossomed into a beacon for many, places like it had started popping up across the country, communities banding together to reclaim lost dreams, rewrite stories, and redefine what aging could mean. Frank smiled as he thought of the countless faces he'd met along the way, people like Carol with her vibrant paintings, Harold playing his harmonica with a renewed spirit, Reggie sharing veteran stories through his podcast. Each one was a testament to a truth he had come to understand deeply: it's never too late to matter. He reached for his journal and began writing, his pen moving effortlessly across the page. I was never too old. I was just waiting for permission to matter again. Those words felt like a release, a key turning in a lock that had kept him prisoner of his own fears for so long. The permission hadn't come from anyone else, it had always been inside him, waiting to be claimed. His thoughts drifted back to the Starship launch, that monumental event that had ignited the fire within. Elon Musk had been a catalyst, not a savior, but a reminder that fearlessness and radical thinking were ageless qualities. Frank realized that the greatest leap wasn't made in the skies but here on Earth, in hearts willing to defy expectations and embrace change. The phone buzzed softly, and Lisa's name appeared on the screen. Frank, she said warmly, we've just received word that the foundation supporting the second launch centers will be expanding funding for the next 5 years. Excitement and relief mingled in his chest. That means we can reach more people, build more programs, and keep the momentum going. Frank nodded, though she couldn't see him. It's more than a program now, he said. It's a movement. And it's unstoppable. Later that evening, Frank stood outside under a clear, star-filled sky. The silence was comforting, a perfect backdrop for the new chapter unfolding. He thought about the countless individuals who had found new purpose, not despite their age but because of the wisdom and resilience it had brought. The fears of invisibility and irrelevance had given way to a quiet revolution, one of action, hope, and connection. As he looked up, he whispered, "Thank you." Not just to Elon Musk or the center, but to himself, and to everyone who had dared to believe in second chances. This was no longer an ending, it was the beginning of a legacy that would ripple outward for generations to come. Frank's journey had taught him that transformation was possible at any age, and that the greatest gift we can give ourselves is permission to matter. With a heart full of peace and purpose, Frank turned and walked back inside, ready for whatever came next. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?